This gentleman, as you all know, that needs no introduction, but let me have a quick stab. So before he became even more famous for the now very famous Stern Report and went on to do great things after, he was the chief economist of the EBRD and then of the World Bank, and is the perfect person to be able to give deep insights into the nexus between policy making, academia, and politics. And I believe that is what you will be talking about for the next 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Vice Rector Anker, if I may be so familiar, thank you very much for all you're doing at the university here and for inviting me. And co-founder Martin, thank you very much for inviting me on behalf of Systemic. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you, Klaus, for mentioning Karl Popper. Many countries claim him, but of course he comes from the London School of Economics, which is... Now, I'm going to talk about the big picture. If you want to make change, you have to think where the big picture is taking us, how you understand the story about how the world works, but you also have to be very good at the detail as well. That's the macro and the micro, if you like. I'm going to talk about the macro, the big picture today, but please don't neglect the detail. I want to ask where the world's going and how it got there. And I'll be very quick about where it is and how it got there, because I want to spend more time on where it's going and, in particular, the next decade or two. But if you want to ask where it's going, you have to have a little bit of a look at where it's come from and where it is. I'll do that in terms of the political agreements. I'll be very fast on technology, say something about where we are on the emissions around the world, and try to spend most of my time on the future. 2015 was absolutely remarkable. We now have a global agenda in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals agreed in September and the Paris Agreement and climate change in December. It is remarkable that we have that. The last time we had anything close to a global agreement was after the Second World War. We'd had 2 world wars and a Great Depression in the preceding 30 years. We surely realized that collaboration was much better than what we had been doing before as a world, and we created the United Nations, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Bretton Woods institutions, the beginnings of the European Community, and so on. This time, we put this global agreement together, not with the 44 countries and one very bossy country just after the war, you know which one that is. We created with 195 or 6 countries the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, looking forward to what was coming. We used our power of reasoning. It was quite remarkable. We continued, but let me underline why we got the Paris Agreement. Of course, we began to understand just how dangerous climate change can be, but also we saw the sustainable development story as the growth story of the 21st century. The low-carbon growth or zero-carbon growth is the growth story of the 21st century. Our investments in infrastructure boost demand and sharpen supply in the short run. They create a Schumpeterian story of innovation, investment, and growth in the medium run, and there is no long-run high-carbon growth story. It self-destructs. This is the growth story, and this was crucial. There's not some horse race between climate responsibility on the one hand and growth on the other. We can find a way to low-carbon growth. Not forever. Forever is a very long time. I'm talking about the next 30 or 40 years. And we have to have that story, both in order to save the planet, but in order to bring people with us. If you say you have to have a managed decline in your standard of living in order to save the planet, you will not take anybody with you, and it is not necessary. The next 30 or 40 years, we see the transition to the low-carbon economy, the zero-carbon economy, as that growth story. We carried on after 2015. I won't go into any detail. This is the story after 2015. I hope the slides will be made available. They should be a public good. But we have continued. Some of you will have noticed there was a presidential election in the United States in the end of 2016. We were the next meeting of the UNFCCC, COP22 in Marrakesh, country after country stood up and said, we carry on. City after city, state after state, the United States has stood up and said, we carry on. At the Hamburg summit of the G20 last year, everyone except the United States said that Paris is irreversible. Irreversible is extremely strong language for G20 communiques. So we have carried on, and it is remarkable in that sense we've passed the Trump test. He hasn't made it any easier. In fact, he's made it clearly more difficult, but we're carrying on. And the reason we're carrying on are the two reasons. Climate change is extremely dangerous, and we can see that alternative growth story. In particular, China and India, two countries where I've spent much of my working life, have been pushing ahead very quickly. Now, the technology story, it's coming in countries around the world, electricity, at 2 cents, 2 US cents per kilowatt hour on auctions. People are ready to supply it at that price. It's quite remarkable. The CEO of Next Era Energy, I think it's the third biggest electricity utility in the United States, has said that in a few years' time, and it's actually going even quicker than he anticipated 1 year ago, in a few years' time, we will be seeing the total cost of solar and wind, the renewable energies, the total cost being less than the operating cost of some of the fossil fuels. We are starting to see it has moved remarkably quickly, partly policy, partly social priority. So, of course, it's much, much more to the story than electricity and power, and systemic other people are working away on the, if you like, more difficult. It's nice to say that now, the more difficult sectors than electricity, because we see how to handle electricity. Those are the very rapid falls in costs that you see, not just in solar panels and supply, but also in batteries, which is very important. So what's been happening around the world? Well, I had a little outburst of optimism with all this technological change, but look, I mean, the emissions go on rising. That is a story still of a strong increase. And of course, in the first 10 years of this decade, the increase in China was of special importance, now more than the United States and EU put together. So it really, really matters that China is changing. I'll say a word or two about that. Global CO2 concentrations, it's of course the concentrations that trap the infrared energy and cause the warming. They're going up still about bit more than 2 parts per million a year. We're about 400 parts per million of CO2 equivalent. That means that if we go on as we are, in 20 years or so, we reach 450 this is CO2. This is CO2 concentrations. That's just the CO2, not the other greenhouse gases. And we're adding a couple or so parts per million a year. So in 20 or so years, if we do not change, we'll hit 450 parts per million CO2, which is roughly the story we tell of the limit for staying below 2 degrees. So we have to change, and we have to change very quickly. 20 years of anything like business as usual takes us way beyond what we can manage to live in the world. So that's where the world is going, but now more optimistic. China peaked coal use about 3 or 4 years ago, and I think China will peak its emissions about now, actually. China's plateaued, you'll see in a diagram in a moment. China's plateaued already. At Paris, it promised to peak by 2030, and that's an extremely big change. India, too, of course, is changing the last 2 or 3 years very rapidly. China, I've been working in China for 30 years and India for nearly 45 years, and the change that we've seen in those two countries, China in the last 6 or 7 years, India in the last 2 or 3, is quite remarkable. And India is unlikely to complete the coal-fired power stations that had already been planned and beginning to be built. This is China. Quite remarkably, if you talk about China, you've got to talk about the 5-year plans. About the time of the Copenhagen Agreement, China's emissions started to decelerate, the 12th five-year plan. They plateaued in the 13th five-year plan. And some of us are working with China to see how fast they can fall during the 14th five-year plan. Most important thing in the next, two of the most important things in this next decade, China's 14th five-year plan, it's the emissions United States and EU put together, let's remind ourselves, and the Belt and Road Initiative. 65 countries, 4 billion people. What happens to the infrastructure in the countries involved in that Belt and Road Initiative, which are largely the emerging market countries of Asia, enormously, enormously important. So I won't say much more about the USA, but we know that the states and the mayors and the companies, they keep going. One of the great things about the United States is how heterogeneous and varied it is, and the dynamism that exists across. And it's quite likely that the US will actually meet its Paris commitment, notwithstanding the current occupant of the White House. So now we turn to the future. And let me just slow down just very slightly. We have to change. Yeah? We've seen we have to change. We have to change in the next 20 years. Our job is to, as people who understand, people who speak, as academics, is to bring the big issues to the table so that decisions can be informed, just as Klaus and the others was describing. So why would people change? Well, first, they're starting to see the effects of climate change in a very powerful way, experiencing it now at 1 degree centigrade. And as Ronnie Reagan said, some things were sensible, others not so, but this was sensible. You ain't seen nothing yet. 1 degree is this. Imagine 2 degrees would be far, far worse. 3 degrees we haven't seen for 3 million years. Homo sapiens, with a generous definition of sapiens, has been around for 250,000, 250,000. 3 million years we haven't seen 3 degrees. It transforms where we could live. At 4 or 5 degrees, London would be by the seaside. This is an extraordinary set of risks we run. But the key thing to getting change is people now see them, even on 1 degree. This is another description of how fast we have to move. We have to really peak and turn down strongly in the next 20 years. Another story of the next 20 years, we have about 800 billion tons of CO2 equivalent left, if you see this story through carbon budgets. If we're going through CO2 at 400 a year, that exhausts in 20 years. Whichever way you look at it, if you look at the preceding graph, if you look at the carbon budget, if you look at the rise of CO2 as I did earlier, this next 20 years is absolutely vital. Here's another way in which the next 20 years are absolutely vital. I've just come back from China, so let me talk about the 3 doublings. The 3 doublings, we double infrastructure in the next 15 years, and that's a pretty tight prediction given the way different economies are moving, demands and supplies for energy, transport, water, and so on. The world economy doubles in 20 years. That's at a growth rate of just over 3%, which seems pretty likely. And the urban areas of the world double in about 40 years. That's just taking 50% of 7.5 billion now, but that we know, and looking at 70% around 9.5 billion in mid-century. That is a roughly doubling of the urban population. These 3 predictions are about as tough, clear, and strong as most of what you get in economics, not noted for its predictions, but those 3 doublings are pretty clear. If that extra world economy looks anything like the one we have now, in 20 years' time, our emissions will have increased very substantially, 50, 60, maybe 100%. That's the period where we have to cut by 20%. Cut absolutely by 20%. Whichever way you look at it, there's graphs on emissions or concentrations or these doublings, the next 20 years are as important as any in the history of the planet. We have to change very radically, but it is a story that is enormously attractive. We've got lots of things going for us. Low interest rates, rapid technological change, we have an international agreement, and we have a growing understanding that this is the growth story. So this is a change which is very attractive. I mean, having cities where you can move and breathe and be productive and cheerful sounds like a good idea, even if you've never heard of climate change. All this is working in our direction. It's a win-win in so many ways, but the change is radical. We can't pretend that this will be easy. It's big change, and getting big change done in politics isn't easy. And China's got it, is really moving quickly and strongly in a good direction. But outside China, we have to see. China's cutting back on coal in China, but helping build coal-fired power stations in Bangladesh and Pakistan. We have to engage, we have to understand where people are moving. But the key story is one of enormously attractive change, but having to do it very fast, and you need political will to do that. So this is my last slide. It's clear what we have to do. At least it's clear enough how we start. Of course, we'll learn tremendously along the way, and we must design to learn. But we know how to begin, and we know it's attractive, and we know we must. That isn't enough to make it happen. I'm enormously optimistic about what we can do. I'm anxious, concerned about what we will do. But that's our job. Our job is to bring the story to the table, express it in a clear and strong way, communicate well, and we have to set out the targets that are necessary, explain the urgency and scale. We have to look where the big places are. The big places are China, India, US, Europe, and of course, not only that. You've got to go for the big stuff because we've got to make big changes. We go for the big sectors, energy and cities and infrastructure and land use and so on. You've got to go for the big sectors as well. So that is of enormous importance, and in doing this, we have to learn to communicate much better. I think we are getting better, but look at the Pope. And the Pope said, if we destroy creation, creation will destroy us. Now, I have personal problems with the idea of creation, but that's my problem. Everybody can see what he means. And what he means is essentially right. He said that God always forgives, people sometimes forgive, nature never forgives. Now, if you're an academic, you can logic chop with that sentence, but you can see it's basically right. And what we have to do is to get short sentences that are clear and strong and are basically scientifically, policy-wise correct. In the Brexit campaign, which was an absolute tragedy for the United Kingdom, the Brexit campaigners said, are you happy in your circumstances? Do you like foreigners? Do you like migrants taking your jobs? Do you like foreigners telling you what to do? 10 seconds, the full Brexit campaign. It took the Remainers, and of course, as you'd expect, I and all right-minded people were amongst them, it took us 5 minutes to clear our throats. We have to get much better at communicating clear and strong. You can tell by my name that my dad would be surprised that I would praise a pope, but this is a very important story of communication. The financial sector, and this is actually a real source of change, very important. Investors now are understanding that the low-carbon economy, the sustainability story, is actually profitable. It's not that you do it because it makes you feel good or you think you're doing the right thing. That's okay. You should do the right thing. But it is also a profitable story. Not surprisingly, because these are the technologies of the future. Not surprisingly, because if somebody plays fast and loose with the climate, they may be playing fast and loose with your investments. If your investment advisor got caught for drunk driving, you'd probably switch, because that doesn't look like a responsible person. We shouldn't be surprised that these investments in the sustainable part of the economy are profitable. And Systemic hopes to make some of those, but work with people who are moving in that direction. There's one letter wrong, mobilize potential employees and customers, that should say. A typo crept in there. Let me give you one example. Unilever gets, I think it's 1.8 million applications a year because, in large measure, their commitment to sustainability and responsibility. They get the best of the best. You'd invest in Unilever because the best people are going there. Right? If you look at our students and postdocs now. 15 years ago, environmental economics was a soft subject. Now the best and the brightest are moving in that direction. It's true of the physicists and others as well. That's very encouraging. So I'm enormously optimistic, again, about what we can do, but deeply concerned as to whether we'll move fast enough. And it's our duty to bring clear, strong, rigorous analysis and clear, strong communication to that table. As they say, let me close that way, as somebody who's been working in India for 45 years, it is our duty. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you just sit down? Lordston made a number of remarkable points, but I just want to draw attention to three. One was the political agreements that he started with were not just about climate change, but they also involved the Sustainable Development Goals, which are inseparable, because I think, which was kind of implied but not explicitly said, it is what happens where the majority of the humanity is, in Asia perhaps, that is going to really determine what happens in Asia in the next decade or so. That more than anything else is going to determine, given the scale of infrastructure, given the number of people there, and the fact that many still struggle with livelihood, what the fate of our whole world is going to be. Our next speaker is someone who embodies both the next generation in response to the top-down grand vision that we saw. You actually need people to be working on the ground, individual project by project, to deliver that 79% fall in the technology costs we saw, to deliver that progress that comes through experimentation and scale. And we need these people to be active, not just in the University of Innsbruck, but out in East Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, and in South Asia. May I please invite Sabrina Mustopo, who is the founder of Krakakoa Chocolate, which is a bean-to-bar social enterprise that has been working thus far primarily in Indonesia, but is going to scale up. Would love to have your thoughts. Oh, yes, there it is. Sorry.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. It's a big honor for me to be speaking here today, and what a tough act to follow after Lordston, but I'll try to do my best. I'd like to start with giving a little bit of context to Indonesia to paint the picture about why we're doing the work that we do. So in Indonesia, about 70% of our emissions come from land use change, or particularly the conversion of forest areas into agricultural land. And at the same time, about 30% of our population, some 250 million people, rely on the agricultural sector as the main source of income. So in Indonesia, the topic of climate change and development and poverty alleviation are all very intrinsically linked. And you cannot talk about one without discussing the other. And even though agricultural development has been a main driver of emissions in the country, I also believe that it can be used as part of the solution. At Krakakoa, what we believe in and the vision that we're trying to pursue is that we're trying to change the impact that agriculture systems have on people and the planet, and we're starting with cocoa. We work mainly around the Bukit Barisan Selatan National Park, which is an area in southern Sumatra, and it's a particularly unique ecosystem because it's home to some of the last endangered Sumatran elephants, rhinos, and tigers left in the wild. It's about 300 hectares in total. And unfortunately, it's lost about a quarter of its forest cover in the last 20 years or so, mainly due to illegal agriculture encroachment. So what do we do about that? Part of the solution that we have as a company, and one of the reasons that we know, one of the main drivers that we know why farmers actually encroach into national parks is because they don't make enough money farming off the land that they have outside the national parks. So we provide them with training, equipment, and resources to enable them to increase their productivity and also increase the quality of the cocoa beans that they produce. A very important factor as well is that we provide them with very, very high price premiums to incentivize them to produce high quality cocoa. Without these price premiums, it's very difficult to create change because even though you tell the farmers, hey, look, 3 years down the road, when you implement all these good agricultural practices, you'll actually benefit. They go, okay, but what about tomorrow? So it's important to start with the price premium and say, okay, if you start employing a sustainable practice today, we start paying you more tomorrow. The reason or the way that we're able to afford to do all of these is that we have an integrated model, something that we call the farmer-to-bar model. So top of the slide, that you see the conventional cocoa value chain, which is heavily fragmented. So between the consumer and the producer, you have up to 8 different intermediaries sometimes, depending on how remote the farmers are. But with the Krakakoa model, essentially there's just us between the consumer or the retailer. And this allows us to pass on a much greater proportion of the consumer dollar, the consumer euro, back to the farmers in order to allow them to have, to incentivize them to employ the correct sustainable behaviors within their farms. And we believe that even though we're working with cocoa today, this is a model that's easily transferable to many other commodities. And even though we're working in Bukit Brau and Selatan, many landscapes or peoplescapes around Indonesia today can benefit from such a model. Thank you very much, and we look forward to your questions.
I think we have time for 2 questions from the audience, and there is a fantastic chocolate straight from Indonesia on offer for the questions, right? Yes. Come on, people. Please.
Could you elaborate a little bit more about how you see your model applying to a more commodity agricultural product like palm oil?
So that's a really good question. I think it's a different set of challenges when we talk about palm oil. Firstly, the system itself has to be sustainable. And how do we make palm oil sustainable? I think there is, if I open the question up to the room, I think there'll be excessive debate of whether that's actually possible or not. But I think the way, firstly, not cutting down pristine forests and actually planting palm oil on degraded areas is one way that you could do it. But even then, we know that there are certain constraints in terms of long-term sustainability and the impact on the soil itself. So I think if we employ a similar system, it's to incentivize the farmers or the growers to say, hey, let's grow on this degraded land, we'll pay you more for it. But it's a much more complicated discussion, but I think it lends itself in that way.
Another question, please, at the end.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is David. I would like to ask Nick Stern, what is the one thing that he would like to do to generate the political will that is necessary to make sure that we don't miss the target? If he had all the power in the world, what's the one thing he'd like to do?
Is this if I ruled the world, what would I do? Or is it that how I'd change the
why
political
don't you do both?
I think you could do both if you don't mind, sir.
I think the Belt and Road Initiative is hugely important. About 4 billion people in those countries with income per capita and emissions per capita about half that of China. If they grow like China grew, or even a bit slower in the next 20 years, so that in 20 years there would be 3 Chinas. So they doubled their income per capita and they doubled their emissions per capita. So you'd have 4 billion people plus like that. So you'd have 3 more Chinas as China is today. That is completely impossible. So what happens in those countries, in Indonesia and Vietnam and India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, as you were saying, Danny, that is critical. So the most important thing for me would be the world, the multilateral development banks, the rich countries getting together with China to try to turn the Belt and Road Initiative, which is the biggest infrastructure story the world has ever seen, to try and turn that into something which is green and attractive. And that's the most important thing to do. In terms of political will, you only give me one thing. I would try to turn it around in Europe. You're seeing the hesitation in the United States. You're seeing the strong will in China. You're seeing the strong will emerging in India. A really clear, strong Europe on this issue could make an enormous difference to the way in which the whole world moves. Not just a strong commitment within Europe, but the strong commitment of Europe working together, particularly with India and China and the other big developing countries. And if that political will could be generated, I think with the Angela Merkel of 2007, Angela, come back, we want you as you were in 2007, together with Macron and other parts of Europe, that could happen.
So if you remember Lord Stern's slides, there was a very important component of land use to historical emissions, but also that's an important part of the solution. It's a very important carbon sink. So a second thing to add on to what was said by the two speakers is, I mean, if you look at a country like India, you still have, if my figures are updated, about a third of the people still don't have access to electricity. And so when we discuss path dependence, when we discuss why the next decade matters, why we discuss already, based on what Martin said and what Lord Turner will speak about, where technology has brought us as to what paths do these countries, do these people need to take to deliver the livelihoods that, for example, you are trying to give them. That is the all-important thing. Now, what political framework, what financial incentives are needed, if technology transfer is part of the solution, if it is mostly about supply chains, I guess all of these are parts of the answers. And over the next few sessions, I'm hoping we will get more answers. But a quick question to the two of you. So in terms of the scalability of what you're trying to do, how do you see that going? So from the bottom-up perspective, how scalable is this? And to you, Lord Stern, how important is land use and stopping afforestation and sustainable livelihoods? Because still the majority of population in India, for example, is agrarian.
So I think in terms of scalability, it's highly scalable. I mean, the business model that we have in place and how we engage with producers can be transferred to coffee, to wild forest products, to many other things out there that can provide the right financial incentives to allow producers to behave in a responsible and sustainable way. I think there is that challenge that being integrated, you are taking on a greater portion of risk, right? Because you are functioning or you're taking on the job of multiple different actors within the value chain and assuming their risk as well. So in that sense, it's important to prove the concept that it works. And once you've shown success there, I think it's easy to then say, okay, this works for cocoa, let's try it for many other commodities as well.
Understood.
Thanks. I spoke mostly about infrastructure and referred to energy, transport, water. But I've come to understand much better over a number of decades now the importance of seeing our natural environment as natural infrastructure. You know, the Sundarbans are seawalls. They're places of economic activity. The forests in the uplands in India, I mean, excuse me, you take Indian examples, that's a country I've been particularly deeply involved with, but they are, the forests of the uplands are water control, their water supply. Infrastructure is something that supplies services that enable other activities. The Sundarbans and the forests in India are exactly that. They are enormously important. We have to go net zero. I mean, that's a crude use of language. We have to balance sources and sinks in the Paris language of the Paris Agreement within 50 years or so. And the natural environment, the land use and the forests are absolutely central. So they're central to our emissions now and critical, but they're also critical if you run forward to where we have to be 50 or so years from now. I've been working in Moradabad district of UP for the last 45 years, following one village. Even on the Indo-Gangetic Plain, which was pretty deforested when I first went there in 74 or so, whatever trees there were have been cut down. India constantly says that it wants to increase its forest areas by 50%. That's been a target ever since I remember, over the last decade. It doesn't happen. This is absolutely crucial, and the fact that I didn't dwell on it, I was partly a luxury that Sabrina was talking about more rural and land affairs, but it is absolutely vital, and that's where we, certainly in systemic, spend much of our time.
Thank you so much to both of you.